Okay, it's one of the great mysteries in English history. Two young children imprisoned in the dark tower of London, nervously waiting their fate before their wicked uncle Richard III sends a group of murderers to smother them to death in their bed. And even in the popular media today, with the discovery of Richard III's bones in Leicester, I've seen it just trotted out as a matter of course that Richard III, England's most infamous king, murdered his own nephews, and Richard III, the wicked uncle who killed the princes in the Tower, and it's trotted out as a matter of course. And it's probably the case that most people, if they've heard of it at all, believe what they read. That Richard III was a monster who murdered his own nephews, child murderer, so on and so forth. And this is why he lost the Battle of Bosworth and this kind of stuff. And the painting that you saw at the start of this video by John Millais, the Pre-Raphaelite painter, encapsulates probably the popular conception of the princes in the Tower. I mean, it's a 19th century painting, so you've got two young boys with their flowing Pre-Raphaelite locks and so on, and they're stood there in the dark, brooding tower, looking nervously around as if they know that their murderers are coming. And this whole romanticised idea of these two innocent children murdered by their wicked uncle is how the Prince in the Tower was a mystery was seen for centuries. What I'd like to do in this video, though, is to present an alternative chain of events, and to present an argument that Richard III, far from murdering the princes in the Tower, was actually the protector of the princes in the Tower. Anyway, first of all then, who are the princes in the Tower? And there might be people watching this video who don't really know who they were. Basically, the princes in the Tower are the two sons of King Edward IV, Richard III's older brother. And the eldest of the princes in the Tower, who's about 12 years old, was actually King Edward V for a few weeks after his father died, until Richard III took the crown himself, following the passing of a law called Titulus Regis, which declared that the two princes were illegitimate because their father, Edward IV, wasn't legally married to their mother, Elizabeth Woodville, because Edward IV was previously married to another woman called Eleanor Talbot, and that therefore the princes were illegitimate. And following the passing of that law, Richard took the throne for himself. And from that follows this argument that within a few months he's had them murdered in the Tower, so they can no longer be a threat to him. Well, the first problem with the argument that Richard III murdered his nephews in the Tower is if he'd passed a law, or a law had been passed, and there was no real expression of mass discontent when this law was passed, Titulus Regis. If a law was passed which declared that Richard III was the legal king, because the two princes were illegitimate and by the rules of the day not able to succeed, why would he then need to kill them? Because they were no longer a threat, because legally they are illegitimate. Now, okay, people will then say, oh, but they could be a focus for rebellion. But surely if Richard had them done away with and killed, Richard would know that may well, even in the Middle Ages, produce a wave of revulsion, which may lead to rebellion anyway. So, arguably by killing them, he'd just be making matters worse. Then, of course, there's the argument, oh, well, they were imprisoned in the Dark Tower of London. First of all, the former Edward V was placed in the Tower, and then Richard's men and Richard persuaded their mother Elizabeth Woodville, who was in sanctuary in Westminster Abbey, to hand over the younger son, Richard, Duke of York, who was a few years younger than his brother. And so he was placed in the Tower as well. Why place them in the Tower of London, a dark, brooding prison? Well, the Tower of London wasn't just a dark, brooding prison in the Middle Ages. It was a royal residence. When Edward V came to London following his father's death, he immediately took up residence in the Tower of London, and nobody batted an eyelid because it was a royal residence as well as a prison. So if you were going to house two royal princes, even if they were illegitimate, the logical place to house them is in a major royal residence like the Tower of London. So, that's the first myth. Richard III, imprisoned his nephews in the Tower. No, he didn't. He gave them royal residence in the Tower of London, one of the top royal residences in England. Okay, that's the first thing. Second thing then is, what about the primary sources? What do the primary sources say about Richard and the princes? Well, the only primary source that's really contemporary, written at the time, is from an Italian called Dominic Mancini. And Dominic Mancini says in his source that the elder prince, former Edward V, was in fear that his life was about to end and so on, and hints that they are done away with, in 1483 when Richard is the king. But where is Mancini getting his information from? He's getting his information from a doctor called John Argentine, who was in the Tower of London for a time before fleeing the country. And he basically is giving his version of events to Mancini, and Mancini is recounting it in his source. And John Argentine was a staunch supporter of Edward IV. Later he became a staunch supporter of Henry VII, Henry Tudor. And, he's hardly, therefore, an objective source. It's in his interest, if he didn't particularly believe that Richard should be king in the first place, to blacken Richard's name. Just because one primary source hints that they might have been done away with in 1483 doesn't mean that they were. Other primary sources, like the Croyland Chronicle, are written in Henry VII's reign. Well, they're hardly going to say a line of argument or a viewpoint that goes fundamentally against what Henry wants known. So, we can question that. The main source that actually gives a blow-by-blow account of the death of the princes, the one that has been used by Shakespeare when he wrote his play, and the one that is used by just about every historian up until the modern age to give the view of what happened, is the source by Sir Thomas More. And if you know anything about Thomas More, of course, you know that he was the guy who was a major figure in Henry VIII's reign, close friend of Henry VIII, did get executed by Henry VIII for refusing to agree to the royal supremacy. So he was a man of integrity and a martyr to the Roman Catholic faith, and he is now a saint in the Catholic Church, etc., etc. But that doesn't mean that his views on Richard III and the princes can be taken as gospel. Basically, what does More say? Well, this is More's history of Richard III by Thomas More, and he basically says that Richard III sent one John Green, who he specially trusted, unto Sir Robert Brackenbury, Constable of the Tower, with a letter saying Sir Robert should put the two children to death. But apparently this Brackenbury is a man of conscience and won't do it. So then More says Richard gets another flunky, a knight called Sir James Tyrrell, to do the deed. And according to More's book, Sir James Tyrrell devised that they should be murdered in their beds. To the execution he appointed Miles Forrest, and joining him was John Dighton, his own horsekeeper, a big, broad, strong knave. And the others having been removed from them, Forrest and Dayton, about midnight, the innocent children lying in their beds, came into the chamber and suddenly lapped them up in the bedclothes and entangled them, keeping them down by force, smothered them and stifled them, their breath failing, they gave up to God their innocent souls. I mean, it's wonderful stuff. and it sticks in the mind even to this day amongst the popular conception of things. Richard III gets Sir James Tyrrell to do the deed. Sir James Tyrrell gets two horrible kind of thugs to smother the princes in their beds, and then they're, according to More's book, buried at the foot of the staircase, or buried at the foot of a staircase mightily deep. And when in the reign of Charles II, two partial skeletons were found buried under the foot of a foot of a staircase in the Tower of London, everyone just assumed it was the princes in the tower, and those bones are in Westminster Abbey. Well, it sounds wonderful stuff, but first of all, Sir Thomas More was utterly loyal to the Tudor crown until he fell out with Henry over the supremacy issue. He's utterly loyal to Henry VIII, so he would say this sort of thing, wouldn't he? But more than that, a historian called Markham found an incredible piece of evidence that had basically been ignored for centuries, and that was that in the summer of 1486, a year after the Battle of Bosworth, when Henry Tudor was on the throne, Henry VII, Henry VIII's dad, Sir James Tyrrell, the same guy, was issued by the king two official royal pardons. One in June 1486, one in July 1486. But the pardons didn't say what for. Later on, in the early 1500s, Tyrrell fell foul of Henry VII for supporting the claim to the throne of someone called Edmund de la Pole, who was the nephew of Richard III. And Tyrrell was tortured by Henry's men anyway, and supposedly confessed that Richard III ordered him to murder the princes. Again, he would say that, wouldn't he? How do we know that was a true confession? Obviously he's being tortured. If you're tortured, you'll probably say anything. Why does Henry want this confession out of this guy Tyrrell, and then it to be broadcasted? Well, I'll present you with an alternative version of events. The alternative version of events is that Richard, far from murdering the princes in the tower, simply kept them there under supervision, in rooms in the Tower of London. And the reason he doesn't bring them out and show them to everyone when rumours start that he's killed them is because that would simply make people see that there's this alternative king still alive, this young boy, Edward, and Richard just wants the whole issue to be buried so he doesn't constantly have to deal with the possibility that princes will become pretenders to the throne. So he keeps them in the Tower of London, and they're still there on the 22nd of August 1485 when Richard is killed in the Battle of Bosworth. Henry eventually arrives in London. Henry finds the princes in the tower still alive, but Henry is about to marry their sister Elizabeth of York, so Henry keeps very, very quiet about the fact that the princes are still alive, because many people now believe that Richard did away with his nephews. Henry is more than happy for that to continue, and so the princes are kept in the tower. Eventually in 1486, Henry decides that he will get rid of the princes. He gets Tyrrell to do the deed, and the version of the events that is in More's book is accurate, but didn't take place in the summer of 1483. It took place in the summer of 1486, 3 years later. And it's interesting that the following January 1487, the former Queen Elizabeth Woodville, who had been at Henry VII's court, was suddenly banished to a nunnery and not allowed to talk to anyone. Suddenly kicked out of the royal court. Could it be that word had reached Elizabeth Woodville that her sons had actually been still alive, and that Henry, who was now married to her daughter Elizabeth of York, Henry had actually murdered Elizabeth Woodville's sons.